Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio, where we tell stories about the surprising ways that sewing impacts our lives. Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode number 30 of Seamwork Radio. So today we're talking about how you can use some specific practices to celebrate your sewing progress and remember to give yourself the pat on the back that you so richly deserve. So today we're going to be talking about some specific ideas, some specific practices that you can use if you find that celebrating your progress and really giving yourself that recognition is something that's difficult for you. So this month in Seamwork, our theme is mindset. So that's why we're talking about some of these kind of ideas that you can use to cultivate a positive mindset around sewing all month. So I think it's really easy to focus on the immediate and focus on what's going well or what's not going well in whatever you're working on right now, rather than recognizing your progress over time. I think that's something that's true just in life, not just for sewing. I mean, for any creative practice, I think that's true. But I think just in life in general, we tend to discount how far we've come. Mm-hmm. Don't you think, Haley?
Yeah, definitely. I can get stuck in that mindset often.
Yeah. And I think if you're not intentional about recognizing your progress, then you don't realize how far you've already come and what you've done, what you've accomplished. And I think that can be kind of demotivating for a lot of us.
Definitely. I think it can be particularly hard when you are someone who's had a sewing practice for a long time. So it can be really hard to remember exactly how far you've come because that was quite a while ago. For me, The longer I've sewn, I find that it becomes harder and harder for me to celebrate progress.
Do you feel like progress becomes harder to see? Because I think in the beginning of any new hobby or sport or anything, you make a lot of progress real fast.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, it tends to slow down. And it's more about very tiny incremental progress, or it's more about polishing your existing skills.
Definitely. And I think that when you get to that point, it's really easy to fall into the trap of looking at your progress in terms of how much you produce, how prolific you are. For me personally, that is the trap that I fall into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the same for me. I tend to focus on whether I'm doing it or not doing it more than the actual progress I'm making, or I don't know, I guess I don't want to say like accomplishing sewing goals or anything, but I guess the big picture tends to fall by the wayside for me sometimes as I focus on, do I have time to do this? Am I making enough stuff? You know, those kinds of questions that are really less important.
So do you find that you're good at celebrating progress generally?
I would say it doesn't come naturally to me.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is true of a lot of people who are very ambitious, that you're always looking at the next thing and you're always really excited about the next thing and moving on to it. And so you're not really looking back and maybe experiencing the kind of gratitude that would help you when you think about what you've already done. So that's something that I've really tried to consciously work on, because it's not something that I feel like just comes naturally to me. What about you?
I mean, I think you took the words right out of my mouth. It's definitely not something that comes naturally to me. I'm definitely been called an overachiever throughout my entire life. And yeah, I think that that's kind of the downfall of having those types of personality traits, is that I really suck at being present. And that's what I think it kind of comes down to, is that I always have my head in the clouds and in the future, and when I would benefit from centering in the moment.
Yeah, I'm definitely a future thinker too. And I definitely identify as an overachiever. I think we're both kind of Lisa Simpson types.
Yes.
It's something that I think you can definitely improve, though, if you're aware of it, as long as you see that it's causing a problem for you and I think future thinking and really just living in the future that's something that you said that I really identify with. And I think once you see that that's harming you in some instances, it's not all bad. I think it has a lot of positive effects too. But I think if you take it too far, I think that's when it starts to become a problem, and maybe creating some more intentional ways that you can snap yourself out of that is really, really helpful.
Totally. So what do you do when a sewing project fails, or like other projects too? I'm curious.
That's a really good question. That's something that I've learned is that's an opportunity to look at your progress and to see and to consider everything you do as part of that longer story, that progress that you're making, rather than living in that sense of failure that you have at the moment. So for me, I think now versus in the past, I really try to look at what I learned from it and note the lessons down, even if it's something that didn't turn out the way I wanted to, and have some kind of a way of doing that. So not just in my own head because it's so easy to get trapped in the emotions around it and the thoughts around it and get frustrated or angry. So I think having a way that you can actually sit down and maybe either write about it, or even if it's just like a bulleted list, but some kind of way that you can kind of reevaluate what went well, what didn't go well, what you learned, can really help to reframe things like that. Don't you think?
Yeah, definitely. I always tend to ask myself what went wrong and go back as far as I can with it. Like, it just stretched out horribly while I was sewing. Okay, well, was that the way I was handling it? Was that the fabric that I chose in the very beginning? So the project was always destined to kind of fail. Yeah, and just kind of digging deep and not trying, maybe not always succeeding, but trying to not see the failure as a personal failure. It was a failure in the sense that the project didn't turn out, but trying to really identifying, regardless of that, what did I gain from the situation? And usually that's some kind of lesson.
Yeah. It's something we try to do at work too. Is
We do.
every single month we have a postmortem on what we did that month. So all of our videos, all of our podcasts, the magazine issue, everything. And we talk about what we liked about it, what went well, what didn't go well. And I think the most important part was we talk about what lessons we learned from doing this and what we would do differently next time. And that helps to celebrate all the good stuff and also draw some lessons in a way that's not judgmental. It's not about this really sucked or judging yourself or judging other people, but it's more about how can we get better? How can we learn from this and move on?
Yeah, we've kind of like cycled through some different ways that we approach the postmortem process. But when I first started at the company, and we kind of revisit these questions sometimes, it's what did we like? What do we wish? What do we wonder? And I find that those phrases are really good for gently framing those lessons instead of focusing on like, oh, I hated this. Like, well, I wish I would have done this. And I wonder if I did this instead, how the outcome would have been different. I use this when I'm talking to myself in my marriage. Really helpful kind of questions to ask yourself.
I think that's a good point. I think asking questions is a really nice way of framing the lessons that you've learned, or just getting curious, just stopping to get curious about what's happening. I think that's such a powerful antidote to a lot of negativity in your life. I heard this phrase from someone the other day in a talk I went to. It was, I think it's when you're furious, get curious. I thought that's so helpful. Like when you get frustrated, stop, especially when you get frustrated with other people, but also with a project, stop and start asking yourself some questions. And I think it's a really helpful way out of the frustration.
Totally. Do you ever look back on the things that you made in the past to kind of look at your progress?
I think I do more now than I did in the past. I left social media a couple years ago, and that used to be a way where I would kind of catalog what's going on in my life and projects to some extent. But after not using Instagram for a while, I kind of had to come up with some new ways of doing that. So now I use the Seamwork community more for that, since we have a place where you can post projects and you have a catalog of all your projects and you can write about them. I find that to be really, really helpful. And they're all in one place, which is nice. And it just gives you a really nice reminder of what you've done. And especially over the course of a year, it's really fun to look back at the end of the year and see what you did, what you made, what you learned. I think that's really cool. What about you?
Yeah, I really suck at documenting the things I made. I am on social media, but even there, I feel like I have like a real fear of sharing on social media. I have a lot of imposter syndrome where I'm like, oh man, why would anyone care about this thing that I make? But like in reality, like I follow mostly people who sew and I love seeing everybody's projects. It's just something that I struggle with. But for that reason, I don't really document things very much. Just yesterday, I was wearing a bra that I made last month. And I was like, man, this pattern is like kind of stellar. I got to tell people about it. I'm like, oh, that means I have to take pictures of it and actually show people. And I don't know. I don't know what it is. It's a major fear for me. But I do look back at things like IRL that I've sewn. I keep a couple of when I first learned how to sew, I learned how to sew when I was studying apparel design. So back then, the things that I made were in a sample size that do not fit me. But I keep a couple of those projects in my closet still because I like to look at them and see how far I've come. I have this corset I made when I had probably been sewing for a couple years, and it was the first thing I made that I felt like really good about. But I look at it now and I'm like, oh, dang, my top stitching was wild. Like the stitch lengths are all over the place because I was like really muscling the corset through the sewing machine. And looking back at that, I feel that's one practice that makes me feel really good about my progress for sure.
Yeah. I think the hard thing for me is in terms of looking back at things just by keeping the garments around. I'm trying not to keep so much stuff. And so I don't keep everything that I make anymore. I was worse about that in the past. So some of it kind of, I feel like gets lost to time if I don't document it in some way. So,
Yeah.
And that's part of what makes it hard to get rid of things you've made, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I don't keep everything, but I like to keep a handful of projects that in that moment where I made it, I felt really proud of it because now looking back at that corset, I guess that was over 10 years ago now that I made it. I felt really proud then, but I feel proud now of like, wow, if I repeated this project, it would turn out so much better. I'm not going to, but it would.
Not so much into corsets these days.
No, that's cool. I appreciate them for what they are, but it's just not my style. It has probably never been my style, realistically.
I think another thing that lately has been helpful to me that I think could incorporate more sewing is I've gotten really into journaling. I think just being in quarantine this last year, it's just been a really good tool for me to document things when every day feels the same.
Oh, yeah.
So I've been journaling a lot more. And one thing I did with the latest project that I made the Easton jacket, and I wrote about it a little bit in my journal, and I pasted in a picture of the jacket as I was making it. And I took some scraps of the fabric that were left over, just some little tiny strips, and I glued them into the journal with it. And it was nice to just have this little memento of something that I made. And I like that it's kind of part of the flow of my life, along with all the other things that are in my journal. But it also gives me a place to reflect about it and maybe write about what I learned or how I felt that day or anything that feels substantial to me. I really like the idea of looking back. I always do a retrospective of my journals at the end of the year and try to find the memories and the lessons I learned that year. So I really like the idea of having the things I made be a part of that story too.
That's beautiful. I love that idea.
So that would actually be my first tip for people, especially if you're not that into social media or you want a non-digital way to celebrate your progress over time and look back at your projects, is just you could start a physical journal. Maybe you could start one specifically for sewing and document your projects there. You could use some of the Design Your Wardrobe worksheets, for example, where you can sketch out your projects ahead of time and then you could write about them afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
I bought last month or the month before, I bought a little mini printer for photos. So you can just take photos on your phone and print them onto 2x3 sticker. And then you just stick it right into your journal. And that's been so cool because, like I said, with the days being kind of all the same while in quarantine, it's just been a really nice way to capture memories. And I think that could be so helpful for sewing projects too.
That printer sounds adorable. You have to send me a link to it.
We'll put it in the show notes too.
Yeah, I'm already like thinking about the cute journal I can buy to start documenting my sewing projects in.
Yeah, I really love journaling, and you can make it whatever you want. You
Yeah.
can do journaling in your own way, whether that's writing one sentence a day or that's having a bullet journal, which is something I've experimented with a lot, or just a traditional writing journal. That's a really fun way to document what's going on in your life and remember things.
So give me your other tips. I need tips. I really aspire to be better at this.
Well, I think the other approach you could take to it, if you're not so much into the analog thing, is just to create some kind of digital log of your projects. And there are so many ways you could do this. If you already use Instagram, a lot of people use Instagram to document their projects. I think that's awesome. But you could also use the Seamwork community because we have a whole projects feature there where you can post your projects and other people can comment on them. And that's a really good way to document, what fabric you used, what size you made, what the pattern was, any other thoughts, lessons, anything all in one place. And it's a little bit more structured than social media. But if you don't want to use either of those, you could also just use your phone. You could take photos or, use the Notes app on your phone. You could just keep a folder of photos if you want. I use Evernote. I mentioned this in the last episode. I use Evernote a lot. I have a lot of stuff in Evernote. And I think something like that is also a really good tool because you can combine photos and words together however you want. So it's a really nice kind of digital journal keeping tool. It seems like not many people are blogging these days, but that's another thing you could do. You could start a blog about it. There's a lot of different ways you can digitally keep track of what you're doing. But I think the important thing is using it as an opportunity to reflect in whatever way is helpful to you and to give yourself that pat on the back and just celebrate what you've done. So that's my second tip. And then I think the next thing is just, maybe think about what are those questions you can ask yourself, or what are those things that are going to be helpful to you personally when you're documenting your projects or thinking back on them. I think for me, like we were talking about earlier, I think lessons learned. What did I learn from this? Is a really nice neutral question, because it doesn't matter if the project was turned out exactly the way you wanted it or not at all the way you wanted it. You can always learn from it in some way. And then related to that, maybe what would you do differently next time? I think that's a nice way to turn those reflections about what you learned into something you can actually do in your next project. I think that's super helpful. And then is there one lesson maybe that you would take away for future projects, for all of your future projects? Was there like a big lesson learned? That might be another question you can ask, but you can come up with your own questions and use those repeatedly. And I think that's a really nice way to cement your learnings and look at things in a more positive light, even if they don't always go the way you expected.
Yeah, I think this is a particularly good tool if you're a future thinker like Sari and I, because it really acknowledges the present moment while still honoring your desire to be better in the future and plan ahead. There's a certain level, I think, of acceptance that I have with the fact that I'm always thinking about the next step and, just acknowledging the good parts of that and finding the ways that I can complement that kind of thinking, just to be a little bit more positive.
Totally. The last tip that I have, I kind of touched on this earlier, but I think this is something that's easy to forget, is just looking back regularly and actually taking the time to give yourself that pat on the back. So not just thinking about how can I take this project and get something helpful out of it, but also just kind of looking back over a longer period of time and celebrating how far you've come and all the things that you've done. That's super helpful. It helps me to look at things regularly as part of kind of a longer story, a longer narrative, and having some times built in for me to do that, like at the beginning of the year, at the end of the year. That's typically when I have like a big retrospective time. And I think a lot of people do, obviously. It's really good to have those kinds of longer term rituals and really think about all that you've done. Maybe if you already do some kind of annual goal setting or looking back at the last year, I think that's a good time to also think about your creative projects and think about, what did I learn? What did I advance on? What did I try? I think that's another thing that we can celebrate is what did I have the courage to actually try? I think those are all really nice things to look back on in the longer term as well as the short term.
Yeah. And that's great for people like me who are not as great at keeping a journal, be it analog or digital. I'm perfectly capable of making a list and reflecting on that, not just a list of the garments that I've sewn, but maybe acknowledging my other creative pursuits and things that I've tried this year and what they've brought to my creative practice, really thinking outside of the box. Because I think that my creativity, obviously, it spans beyond just sewing. It's good to remind myself that I'm not like this singular pursuit. I'm obviously multifaceted, dimensional person, and acknowledging that bigger picture beyond sewing, beyond creativity, just more holistically.
Yeah, I agree. And that's what I like about journaling is the ability to put everything that you're doing into context. For some people, that's, just having a big, massive journal like I do, or having several different journals. Maybe you have like a sewing journal, a gardening journal. And I'm using the term journal very, very loosely. It could be whatever you want it to be, but
Post-its.
Yeah, it could be Post-its. Yeah.
I like Post-its. Okay. Well, I just want to recap a little bit of what we talked about today. So, our big topic today was celebrating progress. Sari and I, this is something that we have to work at. Sari identified us as the Lisa Simpsons, um, which I think is very highly accurate. And Sari shared some really great tips for ways that you can reflect on your progress. And I'm going to recap a couple of those because I personally need to recap because I need to put these things into practice. Number one, she recommends starting a journal, an analog journal. You could make it as low key or intense as you want to, a sentence a day, big long paragraphs, whatever you want, include pictures, swatches, all sorts of things. Really make it your own. You can also do this digitally. You can do this on social media, on the Seamwork community, which has a really great feature for actually documenting your progress. You can even do this on applications like Evernote or just in the notes section of your phone. The third tip she shares is asking yourself some questions. You can come up with your own questions, but the three that she poses are: what did you learn? What would you do differently next time? And what's one lesson you'll take away for the future? But you can totally tailor these questions to fit yourself. And then lastly, she recommends looking back regularly and giving yourself a mental pat on the back. This is really great because even if you're not the greatest at documenting your makes, you can take a quiet moment to kind of reflect on your accomplishments.
Definitely. And if you are interested in more about journaling, I made a video, I don't know, so I guess it was pretty close to a year ago because I think it was at the beginning of the pandemic.
Oh, gosh.
But there's a video on our YouTube channel on how I personally use bullet journaling. So if you want to check that out, I've moved kind of away from that a little bit and more towards just kind of a traditional journaling practice. But I still find it really cool and it was really helpful to me. And it's something I could definitely return to in the future. So if you want to check that out, that's on our YouTube channel, which is Seamwork Video is the name of our YouTube channel.
Cool. And we'll definitely link that in the show notes as well. So you can check that out. If you liked this episode, make sure to leave us a review. You can tell us that you liked it, but you can also share the things that you do to celebrate your progress. Help me out. Give me some tips. I want to get better at this. But yes,
right.
Reviews are a great way to help other people find this podcast if they love sewing as much as we do.
All right. Well, we'll see you guys later.
Thanks. See ya.
Bye. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the Seamwork community, and you can find us at seamwork.com. If you have a story to share, send us an email at podcast@seamwork.com. We'd especially love to hear stories from those whose experiences often get left out of the conversation, whether because of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, disability, age, or any other reason. Again, that's podcast@seamwork.com. You can find us on Instagram at Seamwork and Seamwork Video on YouTube. We'd love to invite you to join us at seamwork.com. We have an amazing community there, as well as new sewing patterns and classes each month for members. Podcast listeners can get 50% off our unlimited membership, which gets you unlimited downloads from our library of over 150 wardrobe-building sewing patterns. Just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find that link in the show notes. And if you like this podcast, please consider giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or the podcast app of your choice. It really helps other people to find the show so they can hear these stories too. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back with you soon. I'm Sari Mitnick, and this is Seamwork Radio.